It was one of those calm Saturday evenings when the little cafe in the corner of the street was glowing with warm yellow light. The sound of soft laughter mixed with the clinking of cups and the smell of fresh coffee beans. The cafe wasn't fancy, but it had a charm that made people come back again and again. There were paintings by local artists hanging on the walls, and the wooden tables looked worn but welcoming. Every weekend, the cafe hosted an open mic night, where anyone could come forward to sing, play, or share their talent. That evening, the small stage near the piano was already set. A few regular performers were sitting nearby, talking about their last week's performances. The host, a cheerful man with a friendly voice, was busy checking the microphone and smiling at everyone who entered. People liked him because he made everyone feel comfortable, whether they were talented or just there for fun. The audience was a mix of students, young couples, and some older folks who came just to listen. Everyone looked relaxed, sipping their drinks and chatting in low tones. It felt like one of those nights where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen, just another round of music and friendly laughter. But sometimes, life has its own quiet plans, hidden behind ordinary moments. Near the back of the cafe, close to the window, sat a young woman by herself. She had been there for a while, quietly stirring her tea, looking at the stage every now and then. She wore a simple outfit, nothing fancy, and her hair was tied back loosely. No one paid much attention to her. She didn't seem like someone who had come to perform. She looked more like someone who had come to watch and maybe find a bit of peace after a long day. The host tapped the microphone, making a small echo across the cafe. "All right, everyone, welcome again to our Saturday open mic night. You know the drill. If anyone wants to perform, just raise your hand. This stage is open for everyone." People clapped lightly, and the first few performers went up one by one. A young man played a cheerful song on his guitar. A girl sang softly, her voice trembling but sweet. Another person read a short poem that made people laugh. The night carried its usual rhythm, simple, warm, and pleasant. After about an hour, the host looked around, smiling. "Anyone else would like to give it a try? Piano's right here, waiting to be played," he said, pointing to the instrument that sat quietly at the edge of the stage. It was an old upright piano, polished but clearly used many times before. First, no one moved. People looked around, some smiled, but most stayed in their seats. Then, slowly, the quiet woman at the back raised her hand. The host looked a bit surprised, but smiled kindly. "Oh, we have someone. Please, come on up." A few heads turned to see who it was. The woman stood up calmly and walked toward the stage. She didn't seem nervous, just quiet and thoughtful. She placed her small bag beside the piano and sat down on the bench. The cafe went silent for a moment, as if everyone was curious to see what she would do. The host leaned forward and asked gently, "Would you like to tell us your name?" She gave a small smile and shook her head. "No, thank you. I'll just play a little something," she said softly. Her voice was calm, and for some reason it made the audience even more curious. The host nodded and stepped aside. "All right then, go ahead." The woman took a slow breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes that came out were light and simple, a tune anyone could hum along with. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a plain melody, like something a beginner might play. A few people turned back to their drinks, thinking it was just another short, ordinary performance. But the people sitting close to the piano noticed something different. Even though the tune was simple, her hands moved with an unusual grace. Every note sounded clear, every pause felt deliberate. There was no hesitation in her touch. It was as if she wasn't just pressing keys, but telling something quiet and personal through each note. A man near the counter whispered to his friend, "She's good, really good." His friend shrugged lightly. "It's a simple tune," he said, though his eyes stayed fixed on the piano. The woman kept playing, her face calm but focused. The way she sat, straight but relaxed, showed that she was completely lost in the music. There was no sign of nerves, no glancing at the audience, no showmanship. Just her and the piano, like they understood each other perfectly. The sound filled the cafe, soft and peaceful at first, then slowly building. The people who had been talking lowered their voices, listening without realizing it. Even the barista paused for a second before resuming his work. The host, standing to the side, crossed his arms and smiled faintly. He'd seen many performers come and go, but something about this woman's quiet confidence felt different. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just playing. As the tune continued, a few children sitting with their parents near the window began to hum along, matching the simple melody. Their parents smiled. The music had a calming effect, like a small wave of peace running through the room. Then, for a brief moment, the woman paused, letting the last note hang in the air. The silence that followed was almost as strong as the music itself. People waited, expecting her to stand up and leave, thinking the piece was over. But instead, she took another breath, placed her hands back on the keys, and softly began again. The same melody, but this time with a little more depth. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. The simple tune started to change shape, as if it was slowly growing into something else. A few people leaned forward in their chairs. The soft hum of the cafe had completely vanished. Everyone's attention was quietly drawn to her. Even though it was still gentle, there was something powerful hidden in those notes. A story maybe, or a memory, or a feeling too deep for words. No one could tell exactly what it was, but everyone could feel it. The woman herself seemed completely unaware of the attention she was getting. Her eyes were half closed, her face calm, her fingers gliding naturally over the piano. It wasn't just talent, it was emotion. It felt like she was talking through music, sharing something she couldn't say aloud. The cafe stayed still. The light from the hanging lamps made a soft glow over her and the piano, creating a picture that no one would forget. For the first time that evening, everyone felt like they were witnessing something real. Not just a performance, but a connection. The melody ended as gently as it began. The woman lifted her hands from the keys and looked down for a moment, almost as if she was saying goodbye to the song she had just played. Then she turned slightly, smiled faintly at the crowd, and said quietly, "Thank you." For a few seconds, no one moved. The silence was deep, not awkward, but amazed. Then someone started clapping softly. Another followed. Within moments, the whole cafe was filled with applause. It wasn't loud or wild, but full of warmth. The host walked over with a big smile and said, "That was beautiful. Would you like to play another?" She shook her head gently. "Maybe later," she said. Her voice carried the same calmness as before. She stood, picked up her small bag, and stepped down from the stage. As she walked back to her seat, people turned to look at her, whispering softly. Some smiled, others looked thoughtful. The woman sat down again near the window, sipping her tea as if nothing special had happened. But everyone in that cafe knew they had just seen something special, even if they couldn't explain what it was. That night, the cafe continued with its usual rhythm. More performers came, more songs were sung, and more laughter filled the air. But the simple tune the woman played stayed in everyone's minds. It wasn't the loudest performance, nor the most technical. Yet, somehow it had touched something deep inside the hearts of those who heard it. Long after she left, people still spoke about her. The mysterious woman who played a simple tune and made a whole cafe fall silent for a few minutes, just by being real, just by letting her heart speak through the piano. And no one knew yet that what they had just witnessed was only the beginning. The next evening, the little cafe felt different, even before the first cup of coffee was poured. The regular customers came in as usual, greeting one another and finding their favorite tables. The same warm light filled the space, the same smell of roasted beans drifted through the air. Yet there was a quiet buzz of curiosity that hadn't been there before. The night before had left its mark. People were still talking about that mysterious woman who had played the piano. The memory of her music had stayed in their minds, like a song you can't forget even after it's over. Some said she was a music teacher. Others thought she might have been a professional pianist who wanted to stay hidden. But no one knew for sure. A few people had even looked up short clips that were recorded by phones. Someone had uploaded it online that same night, captioning it, "She played a simple tune and left everyone speechless." Within hours, it had spread quietly, gathering likes and comments. Viewers wrote things like, "You can feel her emotions through every note," and "There's something deep about the way she plays." But the woman herself didn't know about any of that. That morning, she woke up early and walked through the quiet streets before sunrise. She stopped by the park, where the air was cool and the sound of birds echoed softly. For her, music wasn't about being seen. It was about peace, something she had lost a long time ago and was slowly finding again. She sat on a bench, closed her eyes, and remembered the night before. She hadn't planned to play in front of anyone. She had walked into the cafe only because she liked the smell of coffee and the sound of live music. But when she saw that piano standing silently by the stage, something inside her felt drawn to it. She hadn't touched a piano in a public place for years. There was a time when she played every day in school, in competitions, at small events. Back then, music had been her whole world. But after a long period of hardship and personal loss, she had slowly stepped away from it. Each year, the silence grew thicker, until last night, when she placed her fingers on those keys, something awakened again. It wasn't about skill or perfection. It was about release. Each note she played helped her breathe a little easier, as if she was letting go of the weight she'd been carrying. That's why her music had felt alive, because it wasn't just a tune. It was a part of her. Later that day, as she walked past the same cafe, she heard the faint sound of a guitar from inside. She paused by the window for a moment, smiling softly to herself. The same host from the night before noticed her and waved. "You played last night, didn't you?" he said, stepping out with his usual friendly smile. She nodded slightly. "Yes, just for a bit." "You have no idea what you did," he said, laughing lightly. "People can't stop talking about it. You've made this place famous overnight." She looked surprised. "Oh, I didn't mean to do that." "Well, whatever your reason was, I'm glad you did," he said kindly. "Would you come again tonight? Maybe play something else?" She thought for a moment, looking at the piano through the window. "Maybe," she said finally, "if it feels right." The host nodded with understanding. "Fair enough. Sometimes music decides when it wants to be played, not us." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, the cafe filled up again. People who had missed the performance last night came early, hoping she would play once more. Some brought their friends, saying, "You have to hear her. You'll understand when you do." But as the night went on, she didn't come in. The host introduced singers, poets, and guitar players as usual, and the room buzzed with energy. Still, every time someone walked in, heads turned, hoping it was her. Finally, just when most people thought she wouldn't come, the door opened slowly. She stepped in, wearing the same calm expression as before. The chatter softened immediately. Even those who didn't know her could feel that something special had just entered the room. She smiled shyly when the host saw her. He didn't even have to ask. "You're just in time," he said warmly, offering the stage again. The audience clapped softly, waiting as she walked to the piano and sat down. Once again, she placed her small bag beside the bench, took a slow breath, and ran her fingers lightly over the keys, almost as if greeting an old friend. The host dimmed the lights slightly. The cafe grew quiet. Even the sound of the coffee machine stopped for a moment. She began to play, and once again the first few notes were simple. Just like before, it sounded like a soft lullaby, something you'd hum absent-mindedly on a peaceful evening. But this time there was something new in the rhythm. Her hands moved more freely, her expression a little more relaxed. It was like she was opening a small window into her world. A man near the door whispered, "It's that same tune again." "Yes," said the woman beside him. "But it sounds different now, warmer." Indeed, it did. The melody that had once sounded calm and distant now carried a gentle emotion, like sunlight finding its way through clouds. Each note was familiar, but somehow deeper, more alive. As she played, people began to sense a story forming. There was a pattern, a rise and fall, a hint of sadness that turned slowly into hope. It wasn't something you could explain in words, but everyone felt it in their chest. The music seemed to fill every corner of the room. Even the candles on the tables flickered softly, as if moving with the rhythm. Time began to feel slower, and the world outside the cafe seemed far away. There was something about her that made the moment feel real. She wasn't performing for applause or attention. She was simply sharing something honest, something human. Her hands moved gently but precisely. The melody started to stretch into longer phrases, more complex but still natural. Each key sounded like it belonged exactly where it was. Then, just when the audience thought the tune would end, she paused and shifted her fingers to a lower range on the piano. The sound deepened. A few people caught their breath. The mood changed, as if she was telling a new part of the same story. Her music now carried emotion like a voice, soft but powerful. It spoke of memories, quiet struggles, and moments of peace that followed pain. No one in the room knew what she was thinking, but somehow, everyone felt connected to it. By the time she reached the final section, the cafe was completely silent. You could hear nothing but the piano and the soft breathing of people listening. Even those who didn't understand music could feel its message. When she struck the final note, she let it linger in the air, letting the echo fade slowly. Her hands rested on her lap. She didn't rush to stand up. For a moment, she simply looked at the piano, as if saying thank you. Then she smiled faintly, looked toward the crowd, and nodded once. A quiet gesture of gratitude. The room stayed still for a few seconds before applause filled the air again. This time it was louder, fuller, but still warm. Some people stood up. Others wiped their eyes without realizing why. The host stepped forward again, almost speechless. "That was beautiful," he said softly. She nodded once more and said only, "Music says more than I ever could." As she stepped off the stage, several people tried to thank her or ask where she learned to play. But she just smiled politely and said, "It's just something that's been with me for a long time." Then she returned to her corner seat, sipping her tea quietly. That night, when she left the cafe, the air outside was cool, and the street was quiet. The moon hung low, shining on the pavement. She walked slowly, feeling lighter. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't need fame or recognition. The simple sound of the piano had helped her reconnect, not just with others, but with herself. Inside the cafe, the host looked at the piano with a small smile. He knew he had witnessed something rare, something you couldn't buy or plan. It was the kind of moment that happens only when someone plays not to impress, but to heal. And though no one knew her name, everyone who had been there that night would remember her. The quiet woman who played a simple tune that spoke louder than words. The third night came with the soft sound of rain against the cafe windows. The air outside was cool, and the street glistened under the streetlights. People walked in, shaking off their umbrellas and warming their hands on cups of hot coffee. Inside, the small cafe felt cozier than ever, warm lights, soft chatter, and the familiar hum of quiet excitement. By now, everyone knew the story of the mysterious pianist. Word had spread quickly, not just among regulars but beyond. A few new faces showed up that evening, curious to see if the woman would return. Some carried their phones, hoping to record what they had only heard about online. Others came with quiet hope, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. The host could feel the change too. Usually, open mic nights were casual. A mix of laughter, clumsy tunes, and cheerful applause. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. People were waiting, expecting something more than entertainment. They were waiting for her. As the evening began, performers took turns on the stage. A poet with gentle verses, a young man strumming an acoustic guitar, a small group singing in harmony. Each act was lovely, yet the energy in the room stayed restless. Everyone's eyes kept drifting toward the door. And then, just as another performer finished their song, the cafe door opened with a soft chime. The sound was enough to make half the room turn. There she was, the same woman who had walked in quietly 2 nights in a row. She looked almost the same, calm, simple, and unbothered by the attention she was starting to draw. She nodded politely to the host, who gave her a knowing smile and gestured toward the piano. The audience didn't clap right away this time. They simply watched as she made her way to the stage, her steps light and steady. She placed her small bag beside the piano bench and sat down slowly, adjusting the stool. The cafe grew silent on its own. No one needed to ask for quiet. It was as if everyone already knew something extraordinary was about to happen. She took a breath, laid her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The first few notes sounded familiar. It was the same simple tune she had played before. The audience exchanged small smiles, recognizing the melody that had captured their hearts. But within moments, something started to shift. Her hands began to move differently, faster, lighter, and with a confidence that felt electric. The tune that had once sounded gentle now began to bloom into something rich and full. Her fingers danced across the piano, weaving layers of sound that felt like waves rising and falling. The crowd fell utterly silent. Every note she played seemed to carry emotion. Joy, sorrow, hope, and strength. All blending together in a way that words could never describe. It wasn't loud, yet it filled the entire room. It wasn't complicated for the sake of showing skill, yet it carried depth that went beyond technique. There was feeling in every touch of her hand. People stared in awe. Even those who knew nothing about music could sense that something powerful was happening. The melody began to climb, soft at first, then stronger, clearer. Her eyes stayed closed, her body gently moving with the rhythm. It was as if she had disappeared into the music completely, lost in a world only she could see. Then came a moment, a pause, so delicate it made the entire cafe hold its breath. And then, with a deep, flowing motion, she pressed the next chord, and the sound changed again. The soft tune transformed into a sweeping, emotional piece that made the heart race. The woman by the window, who had been recording, whispered, "It's like the piano is alive." Another person nodded, barely blinking. "It's not the piano," he said softly. "It's her." The host stood frozen near the counter, watching the scene with wide eyes. He had seen many musicians before, but never anything like this. This wasn't just performance, it was transformation. The quiet woman who once played a simple tune had become a storyteller, using sound instead of words. Her fingers flew faster, crossing from low keys to high ones effortlessly, every movement graceful and precise. The melody grew in power, full of emotion, yet never chaotic. Each note had purpose, each rhythm told a story. People began to lean forward, unable to look away. The lights reflected softly off the piano, making the scene look almost dreamlike. The rain outside kept tapping on the glass, blending with the rhythm in a gentle harmony. And then another change. The music softened again, tender and emotional. It was as if she was taking everyone through her own memories, through loss, through silence, and then through finding herself again. The notes carried feelings that words couldn't express. Pain, forgiveness, peace. Some people felt tears in their eyes without knowing why. It wasn't sadness, it was recognition. It was like her music was speaking to something inside each of them. A feeling they had once had but never could describe. Minutes passed, though no one noticed the time. The world outside seemed to fade away. The only thing that existed in that moment was her, the piano, and the music flowing between them. Then came the final rise. Her fingers moved quickly, playing with such emotion that the entire cafe seemed to pulse with energy. The melody reached its peak, powerful, breathtaking. And then, just as suddenly, she slowed down again, ending on a single soft note. Silence followed. It lasted longer than usual. It wasn't just the end of a performance. It was the silence that comes after something deeply human, when words can't fill the space left behind. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. The sound grew louder, spreading through the room. People stood up, applauding, cheering, some even shouting her name though they didn't know it. The host wiped the corner of his eye discreetly, still smiling. She looked up from the piano, blinking as if waking from a dream. For a second, she seemed surprised to find herself back in the cafe, surrounded by people. Then she gave a small smile and stood, bowing her head slightly in gratitude. The applause went on and on, but she didn't bask in it. She didn't wave or make a speech. She simply said softly, "Thank you," and placed her hand gently on the piano as if saying goodbye again. When she left the stage, several people tried to talk to her, but she politely smiled and said little. She wasn't playing for fame or attention. She had simply needed to play. Later that night, when the cafe emptied out, the host sat at the piano, still thinking about what had just happened. He touched one of the keys softly and smiled. She turned a simple tune into a masterpiece. He whispered to himself. She turned silence into something beautiful. The next morning, clips of her performance began spreading online. The video from the night before had already been viewed thousands of times. But this one was different. This time, people didn't just see a talented pianist. They saw emotion, heart, and healing. Comments flooded in. "This isn't just music. It's pure feeling. She doesn't play notes. She plays life. Who is she? She doesn't even need words." Back in her small apartment, the woman sat quietly by the window, watching the morning light spill through the glass. Her hands rested on the windowsill, her mind still half in the music she had played. She didn't check her phone or the videos online. None of that mattered to her. For her, the transformation wasn't about becoming famous. It was about finding her way back to something she thought she had lost forever. When she played that night, she didn't just perform. She remembered who she was. The little girl who once sat by an old piano, learning the language of sound, feeling peace in every note. Now, after years of silence, she had spoken again. Not with words, but through music that came straight from her soul. And even though she didn't know it yet, that night was only the beginning of something much greater. People would continue to talk about her, not just because she was talented, but because she reminded them that beauty doesn't come from perfection. It comes from honesty, from letting your heart speak, even when it's quiet. In the days that followed, the cafe became a special place for many who had been there. Some returned just to sit by the piano, as if hoping to feel the echoes of her music in the air. The host polished the piano more carefully than ever, smiling whenever someone mentioned her. "Yes," he'd say softly, "she played here. And she changed the way we hear music." And somewhere out there, walking quietly through the city streets, the woman carried her piece. One she had found again, note by note, under the soft lights of a small cafe. The night after her performance, the cafe felt different. It was the same place, with the same warm lights and familiar faces, but something in the air had changed. The piano on the small stage stood quietly in its corner, polished and still, almost like it too was resting after what had happened the night before. The sound of her music still seemed to live inside those walls. Even when no one was playing, you could almost feel the echoes of her melody drifting softly in the background. People came in, ordered their coffee, and spoke in low voices, but everyone felt it. That strange stillness, that sense of awe that had lingered after her last note. The host wiped down the counter, lost in thought. He had replayed her performance over and over in his head. It wasn't just about how she played. It was what she made everyone feel. For years, he had run this open mic night, watching countless performers. Some were talented, some were beginners, some came and went without leaving a mark. But she was different. She didn't demand attention. She didn't speak much. Yet somehow, she had managed to make a room full of strangers sit completely still, listening, feeling, remembering. Later that evening, a small group of regulars gathered at one of the corner tables. They were still talking about her. One of them said quietly, "It's strange, isn't it? She didn't say a word about herself. And yet I feel like I know her." Another nodded. "That's because her music spoke for her. You can't fake something like that." Someone else added softly, "I wonder if she'll come back." The host overheard their conversation and smiled to himself. "If she does," he said, walking past their table, "I think we'll know it before she even touches the keys." That night, the woman herself was sitting at home by her small window, staring out at the quiet city. Her apartment was simple. A few books, a little plant by the sill, and a second-hand keyboard she hadn't touched in a while. The city lights shimmered like soft stars outside. She thought about the cafe, about the faces that had watched her in silence, about the long pause after she finished playing. For a moment she had felt exposed. Not because of the crowd, but because she had played from a place inside her that she usually kept hidden. She wondered if they had understood what she was really saying through her music. That she wasn't performing to impress anyone. She was just speaking in the only way she knew how. She touched the keys of her small keyboard lightly, letting out a few notes. It wasn't the same as the cafe's piano. The sound was thinner, more distant, but still it brought her peace. For the first time in years, she felt something warm inside her chest. A quiet sense of belonging. The next few days, the cafe continued to fill up. New people came, asking the same question, "Is she coming tonight?" Some brought cameras, others just came to listen. The host would smile and shake his head, saying, "If she does, you'll know." But she didn't show up for several nights. Then, one rainy evening, just when everyone had stopped expecting it, the door opened slowly, and she walked in. Her clothes were damp from the rain, her hair slightly messy from the wind. She looked around the cafe, at the soft lights, at the familiar faces that turned toward her, and smiled faintly. The host walked over immediately. "You came back," he said warmly. "I didn't plan to," she said softly, "but I felt like the piano was waiting." He nodded with understanding and gestured toward the stage. "It's always waiting for you." She smiled again, placed her bag down, and made her way to the piano. The room grew silent instantly. Even those who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. The sound of the rain outside filled the quiet, creating a rhythm of its own. She sat down, brushed a few raindrops off her sleeves, and placed her fingers gently on the keys. This time, she didn't start right away. She just sat there for a moment, eyes closed, breathing slowly. And then she began to play. The first note was soft, almost like a whisper. The second followed, calm and careful. The melody unfolded slowly, like the beginning of a story. It wasn't the same tune as before. This one was new, quiet, thoughtful, full of space between the notes. It sounded like rain turned into sound. Each key she pressed seemed to match the rhythm of the droplets hitting the window. The audience listened quietly, no one daring to move. Her music didn't demand attention. It invited it. As she played, her expression changed. At first, her face was calm, but soon, you could see emotion building behind her closed eyes. Her fingers moved faster, pouring feeling into every chord. The melody grew, swelling with a gentle sadness. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that heals. It was as if she was telling a story of someone finding their way after being lost for a long time. People watched her in awe. A few leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her hands. The host stood still behind the counter, hardly breathing. The music rose higher, then softened again, weaving between emotion and calmness like waves in the ocean. It was both fragile and strong, like hope rediscovered. And then came that moment, the silence after the final note. She held her hands above the piano, not moving, letting the last sound fade slowly into the air. It lingered there, almost visible, before disappearing completely. The cafe was so quiet that you could hear the rain tapping gently outside. No one spoke. No one even clapped at first. They just sat there, caught in the stillness of it all. The woman opened her eyes slowly, looked at the piano, and then at the crowd. Her face was calm, but her eyes shimmered as if holding something unspoken. She smiled softly, a small, grateful smile, and then finally whispered, "Thank you for listening." Only then did the applause begin. It started small, then grew louder and louder until the entire cafe was clapping and cheering. Some people stood up, others had tears in their eyes. The host joined in, his face full of pride. But she didn't stay for long. She stood, gave a gentle nod to everyone, picked up her bag, and walked out into the rainy night. The sound of the door closing felt heavier than usual. Not sad, but full of meaning. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist. She pulled her coat tighter around her and walked slowly through the wet streets. The puddles reflected the lights, turning the road into a river of gold and silver. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air on her face. In her heart, she felt peaceful. The silence after that final note had been more powerful than any applause. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, a quiet connection between her and everyone who had listened. Back inside the cafe, people sat for a while even after she was gone. No one rushed to leave. They kept talking softly about how the music had made them feel. One man said, "It was like she played straight from her soul." Another added, "That silence at the end. I'll never forget that." The host smiled, looking at the piano once more. He knew what they meant. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of emotion, of gratitude, of something beyond words. As the lights dimmed and the last customers left, he walked up to the piano, placing his hand gently on it. "You did well tonight," he whispered to it, smiling to himself. The next morning, the cafe was quiet again. The rain had stopped, and sunlight poured in through the windows. The piano stood there, shining faintly in the morning light. And though no one played it that day, the memory of her music still lingered. In the air, in the walls, in the hearts of everyone who had been there. For many days after that, people continued to visit. They would sit near the piano, order coffee, and look toward the stage, as if hoping she might appear again. Some said that the cafe felt different now, warmer, deeper, more alive. And maybe they were right, because sometimes one person's honesty can change everything around them, even without words, even through something as simple as a melody. She hadn't said much that night, but she didn't need to. The silence after her final note had said it all, that music is not just sound. It's emotion, memory, and truth. And sometimes, silence itself becomes the loudest sound of all. Days passed after her last performance, but the memory of that night refused to fade. The cafe had gone back to its usual rhythm, the smell of coffee in the air, quiet chatter, and the soft hum of the espresso machine. Yet something had changed. Every time someone walked past the piano, they would slow down for a moment, almost expecting her to be there again, her hands gliding gently across the keys. People began calling that night the night of the masterpiece. The story spread beyond the walls of the cafe. Some who had been there shared short videos online. Others wrote about how the music had made them feel. Slowly, people from nearby towns started visiting, curious to see the little cafe where a woman had played a tune that moved everyone to silence. The host didn't mind the attention, but he missed her presence. She hadn't come back since that night. He would sometimes glance at the door whenever it opened, half hoping it would be her. But she never appeared. Still, the piano remained polished and waiting, as if ready for her return. One evening, a young man walked in carrying a small camera bag. He was polite and soft-spoken, and he asked the host if he could film a short segment about the cafe's music nights. The host agreed, thinking it might bring even more people to their cozy spot. As the man set up his camera, he asked, "Is it true that a woman came here and played something that left everyone speechless?" The host smiled faintly. "It's true. She didn't just play. She spoke to every soul in that room, without saying a single word." "Who was she?" the man asked. "That," the host replied quietly, "is the only question I can't answer." Later that night, when the cafe emptied, the host stayed behind. He sat near the piano, remembering how she had looked, the calmness in her eyes, the quiet strength in her movements. He had a feeling she hadn't just come to perform. There was something deeper behind her music, something she had needed to let go of. Outside, the rain began again. Light at first, then stronger. The sound reminded him of the night she played her second piece. He smiled at the memory, then whispered to himself, "Wherever you are, I hope you're still playing." Meanwhile, across town, she sat in her apartment again, her fingers resting on the keyboard. Since that night, she hadn't touched it much. She had been avoiding it, unsure of how to follow what had happened. The response from people had been overwhelming. Some had tried to find her, leaving notes at the cafe or asking around. But she didn't want to be found, not yet. She didn't play for fame. She never had. The music wasn't something she performed. It was something she released. Her phone buzzed with a message from the cafe host. "You're missed here. The piano feels lonely without you." She smiled softly at the message, her eyes misting a little. For a moment she thought about replying, but then decided against it. Instead, she whispered quietly to the empty room, "I'll come back when I'm ready." The following weekend, the cafe was busier than ever. New faces filled the seats, some hoping to witness the same kind of magic that had happened before. The host decided to open the night by telling her story, not to exploit it, but to honor it. He stepped up to the small stage and began. "A few weeks ago, a woman walked into this cafe. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask for anything. She just sat here and played. And for a few minutes, the whole world went still. The crowd listened intently." He continued, "What she reminded us that night was simple. That beauty doesn't always need a name. And that sometimes, the quietest voices carry the deepest truths." The audience applauded softly. The air in the cafe felt tender and alive. After the event ended, one of the guests, an older man with a gentle face, approached the host. "I think I know who she is," he said quietly. "Or at least I know her story." The host looked surprised. "You've met her?" The man nodded. "Years ago, she used to play at a small community hall near the river. Back then, she was a teacher, not a performer. She'd play for her students every Friday afternoon, just before the weekend started. She believed music could teach more about life than any book could." The host leaned in. "What happened to her?" The man sighed softly. "There was a time when she stopped playing completely. Something personal, I think. But if she's playing again, then maybe she's healing." The host thanked him quietly, his heart heavy but hopeful. He now understood. Her music wasn't about impressing people. It was about finding peace again. The next morning, the host decided to write her a short note and leave it on top of the piano, just in case she ever came back. It said, "Your music didn't just fill the room, changed it, and it changed us." He left it there, tucked under a small vase of white flowers. Weeks passed, and the cafe returned to its usual calm. People still asked about her sometimes, but life went on, until one evening, just before closing time, the door opened once more. It was her. The host froze for a second, hardly believing his eyes. She looked peaceful, dressed simply, a soft smile on her face. The air seemed to shift around her as she walked in. A few regulars turned, whispering quietly, recognizing her instantly. She walked up to the host and said gently, "I read your note." He blinked, surprised. "So you came back?" She nodded. "I came back to play one last time." Without another word, she walked over to the piano. The cafe fell silent. The sound of her pulling out the bench echoed softly through the room. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Even the barista froze mid-pour. She sat down, took a deep breath and began to play. This time, the tune was lighter, warm, like morning sunlight. It carried a feeling of calm joy, the kind that comes after a long storm has finally passed. Each note felt like a smile, like forgiveness, like homecoming. There was no sadness this time, only peace. Her hands moved with confidence and grace, the melody dancing gently through the air. Some people closed their eyes. Others simply watched, afraid to miss even a single moment. The music filled every corner of the cafe, wrapping around everyone like a quiet embrace. And then, just as softly as it had begun, it ended. The final note lingered, then disappeared into the silence. She sat there for a few seconds, eyes closed, breathing slowly. When she finally looked up, there was a warmth in her gaze that hadn't been there before. A quiet acceptance, a feeling of completion. The host stepped forward, tears welling in his eyes. "That was beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you for sharing that with us again." She smiled faintly. "Thank you for listening." As she stood, the cafe filled with gentle applause. No one shouted or cheered loudly. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was pure respect, gratitude, and connection. People weren't just clapping for her music. They were clapping for her journey. Before leaving, She turned back toward the piano one last time and placed a small folded paper on the keys. Then she walked out into the evening light. When the host finally unfolded the paper, he found a short message written in delicate handwriting. Music helped me find my way again. Thank you for giving it a home. He read it twice, then smiled. He didn't need to know her name anymore. He understood everything he needed to. In the weeks that followed, people continued to come to the cafe, drawn by the quiet magic that still lingered there. The piano stood proudly on the small stage, always clean, always waiting. Sometimes a new musician would sit down to play, and the host would listen carefully, hoping maybe to hear a faint echo of her melodies within theirs. And though she never returned again, her presence never left. It lived in the walls, in the soft hum of conversation, in the stillness that followed every last note played in that place. Years later, when people would ask the host about the best performance he'd ever witnessed, he would smile and say, "It wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. She didn't play for applause. She played because she had to, and that's what made it unforgettable." The cafe became known not for its food or drinks, but for its atmosphere, a space where people could feel something real. And in every corner of that place, her spirit seemed to whisper quietly, reminding everyone who sat near that piano of a simple truth, that sometimes a single melody, played from the heart, can change everything, and that even after the music ends, the feeling it leaves behind can last forever.